Hey guys, and welcome to PowerPoint 8. This is about colonial economy, triangular trade, the Middle Passage, and slave codes. So we're kind of picking up where we left off. You've been introduced to all the colonies so far. They've pretty much the 13 original colonies, and now we're going to kind of start talking about a little bit more in depth with each one of those colonies. Okay, so moving in, remember we have the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies, pretty much all along the East Coast, divided into 3 different sections. So this is talking about the resources they have and the jobs that were created based off those resources. So in New England, they have thin, rocky soil and long winters. There are several streams, rivers, and forests. It also has ocean access. So people in this area, it wasn't necessarily a farming area. They didn't do a lot of farming. But so they actually did a lot more of using the ocean and the forest to their advantage. So people in here are craftspeople, shipbuilders, fishermen, whalers, and subsistence farmers. So they didn't depend on farming. They didn't have a large labor force there. It was pretty much you worked in the forest or you worked in the ocean, and that was what the economy was in there. And it was also a kind of a long, hard winters there too, so you really couldn't grow a lot of crops. So moving into the next one was the Middle colonies, that they have fertile soil, a mild climate, and seaports. So they're kind of a mix between what would be the New England colonies and the Southern colonies. People here were craftspeople, farmers of cash crops and wheat, and work large business of lumber mills, mines, ironworks, and manufacturing. Really what the Middle colonies were used for was the center of trade. A lot of the ships entered into the ports that were located there in the Middle colonies, because this is where New York was, and Boston, and some of those places in there. And so this was a hub for trading. It wasn't necessarily a hub as far as fishing or forestry or even farming. This was more where the trade occurred. Okay, and moving into the Southern colonies have rich soil and warm climate. The people here grew the cash crops, the tobacco and the rice. Some small family farms grew corn and tobacco, but for the most part, these were cash crops. This is where the labor force was needed. This is where slavery was needed the most, because they were the farmers of the colonies. They had the soil, they had the climate to grow crops. So this was where the slavery was most common. Later on, at least, and even early on, more workers were needed in the South than anywhere else. Okay, moving into what we are calling triangular trade. So over here on the map, let's talk about the map first. So we have Europe is the small little circle at the top, and then you have Africa in a circle, and then North and South America in another circle. So triangular trade, meaning that there were 3 different locations, 3 different drop-off points for each one of the goods there. So raw materials such as the tobacco and all those different things went to Europe, manufactured went to Africa, and then slaves left Africa and into the Americas. So a triangular trade route was created between Europe, Africa, and the Americas to exchange goods from 3 continents. So triangular meaning 3 different exchanges. From the Americas to Europe were furs, rice, tobacco, indigo, sugar, molasses, and fruit. So anything that wasn't, and when we say raw materials, that means that they weren't processed yet. They weren't turned into anything. They were just created, farmed, and then sent to Europe. From Europe to Americas was cloth and manufactured goods. So they would make goods, and then they would bring them back to America, or they would bring them to Africa. From Africa to the Americas were enslaved people, gold, and pepper. So the trade route from Africa and into the Americas was more not raw materials, but basically most of it was slaves. The slave trade, that was the route there. And then from Americas to Africa was rum, iron, and tools. And then from Europe to Africa was cloth and manufactured goods. So pretty much what you see over here is exactly what was happening. There weren't any actual manufactured goods made in Africa or America, but Europe sent them out in both directions, and raw materials went into Europe, and then mostly slaves came out of Africa. All right, so that's the triangular trade. Now we're going to talk about, in the triangular trade, there was what we called the Middle Passage. So you can see over here, we have the Atlantic slave trade is going on over here in our picture. So just like what we were looking at here, we still have our triangular trade, and we have the raw materials leaving America, going to Europe, manufactured goods going to Africa, and then you can see that that trade route from Africa to America is called the Middle Passage. And it was what we call that because it was mostly about slavery. So slavery was growing in the southern colonies because cash crops such as rice and tobacco required a lot of labor. This created plantations that required a large labor force. So as America was growing, and we just talked about the three levels, or the three different groups of the colonies, in the South, as the crops, as crop demand started going up, we need more crops, we need more production out of there. They needed more workers. And so the best option for them, remember in the last PowerPoint we talked about indentured servants, but the best option for them was not indentured servants, it was actually slaves. They needed the dependency of slaves. They needed slavery to actually be consistent. They needed the workers there all the time, so that's why they started purchasing them. So I talked a little bit about all this last week, or in our last PowerPoint. So West African kingdoms, so those would be kingdoms that were found on the coast, began capturing local natives and selling them into slavery. So I talked about this. They would go into inner Africa and basically go into small inner African communities, and they would steal people. And then they would take them to the coast, and they would sell them to the Europeans that were bargaining and trading for the slaves. They then would be sent on an ocean voyage from Africa to the Caribbean or North America, and this passage from Africa on a boat to North and South America was called the Middle Passage. On this voyage, the enslaved people were chained together and couldn't move. So when they would put them on these ships, they would often chain their legs together, and they would put them in very tight quarters. The Middle Passage was extremely harsh and very brutal. Lots of people died, and it was not a good situation for the people that were on the Middle Passage. They were given very little food and water, and many became sick and died on the voyage. So not only were they entering into slavery, which was going to be harsh on them anyway, if they even survived the Middle Passage, if they even survived that boat ride from Africa to America. So it was tough. The Middle Passage was a tough thing, and it was often seen as something that was very negative. All right, so moving on to the next one, we have the slave codes. So slave codes were rules that controlled the behavior and punishment of enslaved people. So once they got to America, they had to follow certain rules. The codes helped control the enslaved people. If they ran away, they could be punished. If they basically kept them under lock and key, and they didn't have to provide them with anything that, they didn't have to let them go to school. They didn't have to let them get married or anything like that. So they were not taught to read and write. They could not move freely or gather in large groups. So they couldn't go to church, or they couldn't practice their customs or their beliefs or anything like that. And they were often split up. If several family members were brought over together, they were sold to different people. And they often didn't get to see each other or visit each other or anything like that. So it wasn't the slave code. And if you tried to run away, you would be punished, or, there were rewards out there for runaway slaves and things like that. And it was a very harsh time for the Africans that were coming into America. So they were bound. They were bound to their owners. And now, I will say this: not all owners were cruel. Some owners were cruel. Not all were cruel. Some slave owners actually treated their slaves with a great deal of respect, and they might have allowed them to gather in groups. They might have allowed them to read and write. They might have allowed them to get married. So I don't want to lump all slave owners into one category. It's like lumping all of anybody into one category. Not everybody fits all of the criteria when it comes to a certain label. Okay, I'm not going to stereotype slave owners, because not all of them were cruel. Some of them were, some of them weren't. So with that being said, let's move on to the next slide. So we have the vocabulary here. We have some subsistence farming we talked about, which is producing just enough to meet immediate needs. So subsistence farming happened in the New England colonies, where the farming wasn't super important. They might have in their backyard, they might have their own crops back there, but they didn't grow enough to actually sell to other people in trade. Then we have the slave codes. We just talked about that. That's rules focusing on behavior and punishment of enslaved people. Then we have a cash crop. It is a crop that can be sold easily in markets. So people in the South grew cash crops because they had large fields. They had a lot of workers. They farmed to make money. Then we have the triangular trade, which was the trade route between the three destinations. We talked about that. And diversity, which is a variety such as of ethnic or national groups. So as more and more people were coming into the middle, or the 13 colonies, the New England and middle and southern colonies, there was a variety of people. There was a diversity in groups of people. We had all types of Europeans, and we were also bringing in Africans. And it was quite a variety of people that were coming into America. So that's pretty much it for this week. We are kind of getting into a little bit more of what is developing with the colonies, and we'll continue to work on how the colonies are developing and the things that they will face and the trials that they will have. Just remember, you should be taking notes in a spiral and should be taking good notes, and that's pretty much it. So I'll be talking to you guys soon.